Hi, I'm Nate Seberg, and this is One Day Ahead. Welcome to One Day Ahead, Great Gatsby chapters 8 and 9. This is a web series for teachers and students keeping a day ahead of the class. So whether you're on a floaty in a pool or you're rowing a boat upstream, I offer my thoughts and teaching strategies for this American classic by taking you through a chapter summary and analysis of key quotes and advice for teachers. If you're an educator, check out my Great Gatsby unit by following the link below. If you're just passing through, welcome. You can support this channel by subscribing to it. Let's go to the summary. Following the hotel room showdown, the vanquishing of Gatsby and the hit-and-run murder, and the reveal that Daisy was driving, Nick can't sleep. It's probably his mattress. He hears Gatsby arrive home at dawn and goes to chat with him. Nick encourages Gatsby to leave town for a couple of days, but evidently Gatsby didn't read chapter 7 because he still thinks Daisy is about to change her mind. So he's sticking around just in case. He rationalizes his way to it, saying, "You must remember, old sport, Daisy was very excited this afternoon, and the result was she hardly knew what she was saying." So that's dumb. The next few pages are spent filling in more details about their prior relationship. It's nice, but let's move this along. Finally, Nick has to go to work. It's hard to remember these people work, but he does. He sells mods. He promises to call around noon, and Gatsby says, "I suppose Daisy will call too." Nick leaves him, but before entering his house, he turns. "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch of them put together." I've always been glad I said that. With Nick at work, the narrative switches back to the night before, to the garage, following the hit and run. Wilson is understandably in a dark place. His behavior and speech are erratic, but it's clear Wilson believes her death was no accident, that Myrtle ran out to speak with her lover and was murdered when he refused to stop. Wilson declares that he has a way of finding out who it was, and he leaves at dawn. Police are later able to piece together his movements throughout the morning, all except a 3-hour chunk they could not account for. But the upshot is this. By 2:30 that day, Wilson is in West Egg, asking for directions to a mansion owned by a guy named Gatsby. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby decides to go for a swim, something he hasn't done all summer long. He leaves instructions regarding the phone call that any minute now is definitely coming from Daisy and heads to the pool. Nick narrates no telephone message arrived, but the butler waited until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. Nick returns and, along with some staff, finds Gatsby floating dead in his pool, his blood mixing with the water in the fallen leaves. It's not until they start carrying him up towards the house that they find Wilson as well, lying in the grass, the victim of his own grief and gunshot. And that concludes chapter 8. Chapter 9 finds Nick at the center of Gatsby's funeral arrangements. He first tries to contact Daisy, but she and Tom have left or really fled town. Next, he reaches out to Wolfsheim, who refuses to come to the funeral. Wolfie says, "When a man gets killed, I never like to get mixed up in it in any way. I keep out." Wolfsheim's office, by the way, is labeled the Swastika Holding Company, but don't read into this. When Fitzgerald wrote this, the Nazis weren't really a global thing yet. So Nick is striking out for his dead friend, but finally Gatsby's father appears. He's a cute old grief-stricken man who's read about his son's murder in the paper. Walking around the mansion, he shows awe and pride at what his son has accomplished. Gatsby's memorial is held at the house, but nobody comes. Then the sad little procession moves down to the cemetery, where only one other guest turns up. It's Owl Eyes, that drunk guy from the library. When he's told no one came to the house, he sums it all up perfectly. Why, my God. They used to go there by the hundreds. The poor son of a bitch. A few more disconnected things wrap up the book. Nick has a regression about taking the train west during school. I'm sure it's full of deep and resonant meaning, but I mostly don't get it. He also closes things up with Jordan Baker, who in a bit of relationship jujitsu suddenly claims to be engaged to some guy. She'll really do about anything to stay aloof and detached. That's kind of her jam. And finally, Nick encounters Tom in New York. Tom holds out his hand, but Nick does not. "What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me?" "Yes," Nick responds. "You know what I think of you." Wait, did Nick finally grow a backbone? "Tom," I inquired, "what did you say to Wilson that afternoon?" He stared at me without a word, and I knew I had guessed right about those missing hours. Missing hours refers to Wilson's movements on the day of the murder. Nick has guessed that Wilson visited Tom and that Tom gave him Gatsby's name as the driver of the yellow car. Tom responds hotly, "What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust into your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog, and he never even stopped the car." Nick narrates, "There was nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true." And as for no backbone, he does shake Tom's hand before leaving, but the text says that it seems silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. So Nick doesn't find courage per se, but he does reframe Tom as someone to pity, not confront. So, like baby steps. The book comes to an end with Nick readying to return west. He is emotionally speaking exactly where he started this book, disgusted with everyone and everything out east except Gatsby. He muses on wonder, hope, and the dream and promise of America. He brings us back to that moment Gatsby first picked out that green light. And the text concludes with these lines. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And that's the summary. My people, Fitzgerald was a layered writer. He often concealed rich characterization in subtle phrases that a reader in a hurry might miss. That, or I'm way overreading this. You make the call. This is Deep Dive Quotes. So our first quote deals with Gatsby. It comes in chapter 8 after Gatsby's all-nighter in Daisy's garden, which I realize sounds like blatant innuendo, but it's real. I don't know how to say it. It's what happened. Nick spent the morning with Gatsby, who had just lived through the crumbling of his obsessive dream. As Nick is leaving for work, we get this exchange. I'll call you up, I said finally. Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon. We walked slowly down the steps. I suppose Daisy'll call too. He looked at me anxiously, as if he hoped I'd corroborate this. What I find tragic here is that Gatsby's line, I suppose Daisy'll call too, it ends in a period. It's not a question mark. It's a statement that he makes, because to ask the question is to step toward an answer that he is unwilling to face. But behind that declaration is a cry for help, because he looks to Nick with anxiety, hoping for reassurance and validation, which Nick gives because, no backbone. I think Gatsby is giving us a window into what the next 40 years of his life is going to be, or it really would have been had he not been killed 9 pages later. Gatsby is now stuck in a sad sort of limbo. He's unable to pursue Daisy, and yet equally unable to see that he's reached the end of this road. I do believe Gatsby would spend the rest of his life turning the questions he should be asking into statements he can leave blissfully unexamined. The last quote is the parting thought of this book. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. With this line, Nick not only encapsulates the life of Gatsby, he also universalizes his experience to humanity in general. We are all of us afflicted by and yet pursuing a past we can neither catch nor quit, both enchanted and ensnared by a dream forever just beyond our grasp. And in Gatsby, we find the best and worst of our nature. Our ability to deny the truth is matched only by our capacity to hope for a better tomorrow. If only we run just a little faster, stretch out our arms a little further than one fine morning. And so we, like Gatsby, we beat against the current, drawn towards the green light of our dreams, and yet victim to a reality as relentless and indifferent as a river. It's a fatalistic downbeat to end on, but this was no fairy tale. And that's Deep Dive Quotes. So this book is complex. It's a thin little volume, but there's so much packed into so little that for a teacher, it can be hard to know what to aim at. That's why I'm here. Teachers, let me give you my take. So I combined the final 2 chapters of this text because chapter 8 is short and chapter 9 has a tendency to drag. If you follow the link in the thing, these 2 chapters will be the final literature circle prep and meeting. And for our purposes, we treat them as one thing. As ever, I begin with an entry task. Here are a few things that are true about Gatsby. He lives in a perpetual state of denial. He's in love with another man's wife. He carried on an affair with a married woman. He's a criminal, bootlegging, and probably worse. And he was party to a hit and run and covered it up. And yet, in chapter 1, Nick declares that he loves this guy. Here's my question. What is there to love? I spend the last group discussion turning our attention to the culminating piece of this unit. I always focus on the same question. In what way, if any, is Gatsby great? So do what makes sense for your kids, but I recommend character autopsies. Gatsby is dead, and we need a team of coroners to determine the cause of his death and the source of his greatness. Turn them loose dissecting Gatsby and one more character. Most groups will make these life-size posters, but I've seen some really creative dissected bodies. Now, some things you should look out for. It's hard to believe, but after chapter 8, a lot of kids will actually miss that Gatsby's dead. It's because we don't actually see the shooting and because of this line. It was after we started with Gatsby towards the house that blah, 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 blah. Since it doesn't say Gatsby's body, they think he's walking there. Next, a heads up on the swastika in chapter 9. The fact that the family is Jewish will get everybody going on wild theories of infiltration and betrayal, but the truth is boring. It's just a coincidence. The final lines is this week's If You Only Hit One Thing. The text ends with Nick returning west, completing the circle back to the beginning. And his final line is fatalistic, and perhaps it has a right to be. Gatsby, George Wilson, and Myrtle, the characters trying to change their circumstances, anyone with big dreams or new money, they're all dead. Only old money, Tom, Daisy, Jordan, and Nick remain, and they're exactly the same. Daisy and Tom are still hiding in their wealth and running from mess to mess to mess. Jordan remains aloof and detached as ever, and Nick is returning to exactly the place he started. The world is unchanged. The climbers have all fallen, and decadence has caught up to those with unworthy dreams. Living too large and too fast, and then paying a big price, when looked at through the lens of the coming financial crash and Great Depression, a lot of this reads like prophecy. And that, my friends, is The Great Gatsby. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. Thank you to my dad, Jamie Seberg, for filming and script editing, Brian Zaro for the camera, Joe Tobiasen for the tech support, Madeline Johnson for the eyes of God, Christy Podelnik for the optimism, and to my wife, Bria Seberg, for patience with a lot of late nights and early mornings. Next time, we dive into Huck Finn, because the internet is great at parsing sensitive and often deeply offensive text. All that and more next time on One Day Ahead.